All right, welcome back, all. This is going to be continuation of Chapter 19 for Macroeconomics, and we're going to talk about improving standards of living, unemployment, and inflation. All right. So, if you'll continue with the notes, we will move on to Section 19.2. How do states increase the standard of living for their citizens? For the rich country set, it's relatively straightforward. From the neoclassical perspective, at least, you just want to be constantly pushing out the LRAS, right? Your long-run aggregate supply curve. And as we've learned with the neoclassical set, the philosophy of Say's, the LRAS is always vertical. At least under the theoretical conceptions of the supply side, and so the government, whatever government it is, they want to be pushing policies that move the LRAS to the right, and this can be a number of things, right? It can be investments in your human capital, that would include health or training, education, that sort of thing. It can include tax cuts for investment. It can include investment from the government itself, such as infrastructure, research and development, that sort of stuff. It can be new production facilities or techniques, all kinds of stuff. You just want to be able to push the supply curve out, because for the most part, in high-income countries, you're running at or near the production possibilities frontier curve, the PPC, and it shouldn't be. You shouldn't have to really worry about the demand side unless you get a severe recession or depression, right? And so, for the most part, you should just be supporting policies that push the LRAS further to the right. Things change a bit for middle-income countries, and this is going to be the Asian tigers. So the Asian tigers are sort of considered this set of South Korea, sometimes Japan, but mostly South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, these sorts of countries that are in the middling range. And then you also have a new term that's sort of come about in the last 10 years, and this is BRICS. And BRICS is to be included in the second tier of states, right? And BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. All right, so the second tier of states basically is the South Asian tigers and the BRICS states, basically, and other countries are trying to make their way onto that stage, but we'll talk about the low-income states and the difficulties that they have in a second. All right. Why are some middle-income states more successful than others? So if you look at sort of the Southeast Asian states versus South America, we've talked about sort of export-driven economics versus the import substitution industrialization of South America, and the different philosophies and the different results and the different contrasts and the different investments and all kinds of different stuff, right? So there were big differences. Another big difference was the savings rates. Southeast Asian states, for a number of reasons, including their own sort of political and social philosophy, have higher savings rates than much of the rest of the world. And their people generally are saving around 1/3 of their income or more, which gives their governments and their banks and their firms more access to capital to borrow against and invest, et cetera, right? There's also more room for shocks, for people to be okay, less need for the state to jump in and try to inject funds, etc. So that's one of the big differences. The second is human capital, right? We've talked about with ISI, a lot of the investments were on sort of infrastructure, but also on military, on trying to create facilities to compete in high-level goods like automobiles, refrigerators, stuff like that. It just doesn't work, right? And the ISI countries had a really hard time. We found that you sort of need to make a transition up through the scale. You can't just build an automobile industry from scratch. It doesn't work. You'll be just pumping in waste dollars forever, and it will never really become competitive because of that. And so it's bound to fail, right? And so the export-driven societies, they spent their money a little more wisely on things like human capital, on basic export production until they could ramp up to more advanced production facilities and capabilities. They focus a lot in those nations on education and on STEM, which has been just absolutely vital in today's world, especially as things move more and more and more towards internet, programming, algorithms, mathematics, all of this stuff, right? And so these different, and teacher pay has also been a very popular one. And teacher pay has actually helped to distinguish some of the more successful countries around the world, like South Korea, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, South Korea. One of the big markers of these nations, and one of the big drivers in their success in the educational fields and in future research and development and things of this sort, is their education systems. And the fact that they respect the education systems, they hunt out the best and the brightest to be their teachers and professionals in the academic arena. Some countries take a different approach, and in America, there are some problems, as we've talked about. There's also problems that a lot of economists discuss, like for some reason there's a lot of coaches in the classrooms who didn't actually get a real teaching degree, and yet a lot of money is being funneled into sports, and the coaches are only expected to go get some sort of like certificate to learn how to teach, and they have almost no background whatsoever in what they're teaching. And so this is another problem that we're seeing, especially in the South, with education systems. We've talked about property value taxes and how they fund schools. There's just a lot of problems in American schools, and a lot of it is just the disrespect and disregard for education, which is very strange. And which seems to be growing in our society, this almost hatred for the educated and education. It's a very strange trend, but anyway, that is one of the things that differentiated sort of the Latin American set versus the Eastern Asian set. We should also talk about importing technology, and importing has a lot of different connotations. This has been legitimate in many senses through partnerships with the United States, because, as we talked about a little bit, some of the more successful countries have also been some of the more strategic United States military partners. And so we have set up a lot of programs where Japanese, South Korean, etc., students and sort of apprentices can come into United States universities and learn and take their education back to their home country. We have partnerships abroad, but there's also been outright espionage, just straight up picture taking and theft of intellectual property and production techniques and things of that sort. So this is something that is becoming harder and harder to control, especially with the ubiquity of hacking and that sort of stuff. So it's very difficult, because there's this sort of arms race that we've touched on a tiny bit, but there's an arms race with the hackers and then the security firms, right? As the security firms get better and better at protecting against it, the hackers get better and better at breaking, and it just keeps ramping up, right? And so this is this sort of the arms race problem. And I would suggest that any of you go see Dr. Strangelove for some really interesting political science and economic theory sort of brought to life by many standards, one of America's greatest films. So really, really interesting stuff. Anyway, we're getting off topic. Let's see. Oh, another one that these, at least if you're a free market state, you can offer incentives like tax breaks and grants and research opportunities, things of this sort, to firms and things of that sort. To firms, to students, to inventors, all kinds of stuff, right? This can become a problem, right? And we'll talk about this here a little bit at the bottom in the last section, but we'll touch on it at the end. Let's see. The free market I also want to touch on because this is absolutely vital. I mentioned it before, but there's really not much room for success for a non-free market state, at least as things stand today. So I think this is really interesting. Now the struggle between how free market do we want to be is a whole different question, but I don't really think it's much of a question in economists' mind that the market and the natural tendencies and benefits of the market system are just necessary to growth and to economic success in general in the modern world. Let's see. Inherent problems, right? There are problems with this that we've seen, and South Korea is a good model. South Korea and many of these sort of second-tier states or third-tier states trying to move into the second tier, what they'll do is they'll back what's called an infant industry, something that they think will be important, and maybe it's strategically important, economically important, logistically important, whatever it is. They'll back particular industries to try to get them off the ground and make them competitive. We've seen some of the problems with the pricing of trying to get into new industries, right? It can sometimes be cost inefficient to try to break into an oligopolistic or monopolistic industry, and so the government can help to at least get your feet off the ground, right? The problem is they never really step away. It's become politically easy to sort of funnel money into that industry, and then that industry becomes sort of bloated and creaky, and the more the government tries to prop it up, the less efficient and innovative it becomes, and so eventually you just have the state propping up all these crap industries, and it almost sort of turns into like this communism problem, right? Where the state is deciding who does and who does not survive in the market, which was never the intention to begin with, and yet the natural tendencies of human behavior and power politics sort of lead to this natural extension, one of these negative externalities. So this is something to be careful of. Trying to help an industry get its feet off the ground, which can be wonderful for your economy, and hiring and all kinds of different stuff and innovation and everything. But then you really need to just step away and say, all right, you got to stand on your own 2 feet at this point, because we cannot simply keep pumping you money. Not only because it's not the right thing to do, we need to go support other industries, but also because it's just going to make you worse. Anyway, all right. Low-income states are real problems, and there's a lot of cool Nobel Prize-winning research that is focused on low-income states and how we can improve things in those states. I've got a huge list here, and we'll touch on some of them. First is property rights. You gotta have laws. You have to have not only laws, but also sort of this the liberal model, not from a political standpoint, but from sort of a philosophical John Locke viewpoint, you need the things that the liberal philosophy is built upon, right? You need free speech and the ability to assemble. You need property rights to be as specific as possible. The less ambiguity, the better, always. You need an independent judicial system. And you need a judicial system that holds everyone equally accountable. These things are vital. All of these things are vital to having a functioning state. And the further you get away from all of them, the more likely that you're going to start to get state collapse, investor flight, fear in the system, corruption. None of these things are good for your system, ever. You want to reduce the likelihood of risk. You want to induce the likelihood of huge swings in your system. You want to try to just simply stabilize things. Man, my hair is crazy today. It's hard. It's hard because you need investment. You need education. You need intelligence. You need integrity. You need a lot of things that is really hard to build a modern functioning state, right? And property rights and sort of the liberal philosophical model, not the liberal political American model, are vital to this. You need anti-corruption laws, and this is sort of what I was touching about on where everyone needs to be equally held equally accountable before the law, who, regardless of how rich or powerful or poor or impoverished you are, everyone needs to stand equally before the law and the property rights of the law. Enforcement is absolutely vital, and this is one of the real problems that exists in all societies, not even just third world societies. Politicians love to pass laws, they love to make big scenes, they love to use pretty words, but then they don't actually enforce anything. And it costs money and time and professionalism and training to have institutions that actually enforce laws. And so this was one of the big problems with the 2007 and 2008 crash, was that we just didn't have enforcement. We have lots of laws on the books. Yes, we had plenty of deregulation that didn't help the situation. But we had plenty of laws on the books, too, that did help the situation, but that weren't being enforced because no one cared, because people were making money hand over fist and then donating it to political campaigns on both sides of the aisle. And so they could just sort of pay lip service to the idea of enforcement and everyone's being held equal. But the reality was people were just getting away with breaking the law that existed because no one was doing anything about it, all right? And this is what happens in second-tier and third-tier countries, and it gets way worse than it is in the United States and in the developed world. While I get frustrated with the situation in the U.S., it's nothing relative to, say, Eritrea or Mali or Malawi or any of these really broken and corrupted states. Let's see. Independent courts and judges, we talked about that. I mean, you cannot have, again, this all ties into everyone must be held equal, and for that to happen, you must have independent courts, economic institutions, judges, all of these things, all right? And all of these different laws help to reduce the likelihood of uncertainty, of complete collapse, or of nationalization. The idea that, or expropriation, it's sort of this two words for the same idea. The state just comes in and takes your entire firm, right? And this is what happened in Venezuela. The state took a lot of firms. This happened in North Korea. It's happened in a lot of different places across the world where people are very frustrated with the exploitation that is occurring, and you get this hyper inequality, and people get really angry that the hyper rich, and I'm like struggling to feed my kids down here, and so politicians step in and say, you know, we're going to take the Marxist approach, and we're going to steal your corporation and kick you out, and too bad for you. Man, you don't want that to happen, because we see what happens. Investors punish you for that sort of behavior, and states like Venezuela collapse, right? And so it can turn into a really nasty game. That doesn't help the people whose company was stolen. It doesn't really help the people at the bottom of the society either. I mean, look at how everyday Venezuelans are living right now. It is a complete disaster. It doesn't help anyone, honestly. Like strict and stringent and explicit rights are really vital to a functioning system. Well, we talked about free market plenty of times. We've talked about peace plenty of times. We should talk about the poverty trap on the aggregate. It means something different than that at the micro level, but it's relatively similar. Savings are basically impossible in these states. I mean, imagine you're living on $1,000 a year, and you have a family of 12 or whatever it is, and you have a family of 12 because they can help you produce more food. So you're not actually making a stupid decision, as some people think that like overpopulation is. They're making the rational decision. They need the labor, and some of those children will die. And so they need not only the labor, but they need someone to take care of them in their own old age. And so the tables on rationality are turned dramatically depending on your life circumstances, right? And so I don't think it's responsible or very thoughtful to say, oh, you're just stupid, you should stop having so many babies. It's a very, very different society, economy. It's very different. It's very different. And they have very different equations as to what is a rational choice and what is not. They're also highly uneducated because they can't save any money. Their kids have to work all day. They don't have any money to build schools. They don't have any money for anything. And just giving them aid isn't helping anything either, right? It can be harmful. If you're not being taught to be responsible, then you'll never have a competitive industry. You'll just always have this sort of baby industry that can't compete in the real world, right? And so that's not all that helpful either. And so this is a really very difficult trap. And from what we're learning, the best thing that you can really do is truly script private rights, property rights, environmental damage, all these sorts of things, so that you can begin to build industries where people know that, okay, well, this belongs to me, that belongs to you. We can make rational decisions about the values of things, and I can rationally believe that I'll be able to, save this money and it'll be worth something in the future. Or, there's so many problems, but it all really starts with trying to define people's rights. Cleaning up violence, cleaning up corruption, trying to put together an independent government. Independent, at minimum, you need an independent central bank and you need an independent judiciary. And hopefully we could also add to that things like an independent and legitimate police force and other things. But like at bare bones minimum, you need a justice system, and you need economists who know what they are doing, and to be independent from political swings. All right. Section 19.3, the causes of unemployment around the world. I would rather just sort of talk about the differences in natural unemployment rates. We find that generally the United States and Japan and sort of the South Korea Asian tiger set is around 4.5 to 6% on average. The EU is at about 8 to 10% on average, and sort of the second and third tier are at 10 to 30, 40, 50% in some of the worst places. So it could get really bad. But there are big differences. Why? One of the reasons is that the EU has a lot more protective measures for its labor. It is harder to hire, it's harder to fire, their pension packages are a little nicer, their vacation packages are a little nicer. And so this causes a little more friction, right? Companies are a little more nervous about hiring new employees because if they suck, it's hard to get rid of them. So it causes a bit of a higher unemployment rate, just naturally in the EU, and they're okay with that. They're okay with that because they also have set up a more I guess giving sort of like social welfare system. And so even if you're unemployed, you're going to be okay. We'll get you back into a job eventually. At least this is the philosophy and the theory, right? Let's see. One of the problems and the natural occurrences that we're finding, the sort of negative externalities, is that the young take the brunt of this unemployment. Once you have a job, it's pretty easy to stay on the rolls or get a new job, move, that sort of thing. But companies tend to just refuse to hire young people. And so we're starting to see this pattern across the world where we're seeing high rates of youth unemployment. It's leading to some weird things. It's leading to sort of an explosion of the far-right movement. It's leading to a lot of sort of the advent of social media too, of a lot of weird like conspiracy stuff. There's a lot of violence among young men, especially in like third world countries, and especially where you see new migration of immigrants into a place where there is high unemployment amongst young men already. There's some real violence and tension in some of these areas. And so it's something to sort of keep an eye on. Again, I don't think you can, you're unemployed, you're frustrated with your own society, and now you have immigrants trying to better their own life. The frustration is real, right? Now, how it gets expressed is the most important point. It can get out of hand if I don't know, leaders aren't careful about it. And this isn't just government leaders; it's community leaders, church leaders, community organizers, and yes, government leaders and institutions, policing leaders. All of these people should be coming together and saying, "Look, we know why this is happening. We know what the frustration is about. How do we help to resolve some of these issues without getting violent?" I really hope we can get better at doing some of that in the near future, especially with people with mental health issues coming out of the pandemic. We're seeing just violence all through the news. It's getting a little worrisome. Anyway, we'll move on. South America and Africa, they just generally tend to have poor economic conditions. I mean, they're not exactly pushing their production possibilities frontier curve, right? I mean, they are slack, weak, tepid, flaccid, however you want to describe it. It describes these sort of bottom tier states, bottom tier economies. And there's a huge mix of different things, corruption, the resource curse, geographical location, like all of these things that we talked about before, Marxist policies, and lots of stuff. But it is very difficult to try to pull these states up because there's not really any money to invest. There's not any money. There's no middle class. the poor class is just basically feeding themselves, and that's it. And so there's not any money to invest in, and so investment has to come from abroad. And that can cause serious problems, like we've talked about with capital flight, inflation, hyperinflation, etc. These can be real difficulties. Let's see. Yeah, last point, I guess. High non-repayment rates are really scary for investors. Remember, the best way to increase investment is to reduce risk, right? Because sometimes investors are looking for risky, big payoffs, but most of the time, investment is about, just growing your money relatively safely, right? And in this sense, some of these states are really scary investments because they often don't pay their loan service. And so even the quote unquote good economies in some of this area, like South Africa, Argentina, or even Venezuela, who was a really hot country, back before some of you were born, in the early 2000s, Venezuela was doing really well. And part of that was because of Hugo Chavez's policies. Part of it was because of high oil prices. Part of it was because they had a strong middle class, but they collapsed. And a lot of it is because of this non-repayment, the nationalization of industries and fear of investors, the capital flight and inflationary tendencies. And I mean, it's a perfect example of everything that we've been talking about so far. This state that was doing pretty well and was pretty well respected on the international scene, and was sort of a, quote unquote socialist all-star. And then after Hugo Chavez's collapse, the state collapsed, and it's almost a perfect example of all of these little things that we've been talking about on the international scene. So we've seen this, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Egypt, in Russia, all across the world. So investors get really tired of losing their money, and they start looking for safer bets. So I hope you enjoyed. I really like this stuff. I don't want to put too much on y'all, though. So have a wonderful day. Be happy and healthy. And I will get the test up probably tomorrow. All right. See you soon. Bye.